Thank you so much. Sometimes when I'm feeling a little full of myself, I say I have the best carnivorous plant nursery in Tampa. I published this book. There we go. I published this book in October. I wrote it during COVID, so I'm very excited to be presenting it to you today. This is maybe my 15th or 16th Native Plant Society's chapter's presentation on this. And basically after tonight, I am going on a long, long vacation until September 3rd. I've been touring for 11 months for this book, yeah. So I'm excited. And the reason why I get to talk to you today is because when I was a senior in high school, the hall monitor, the person who yells at people for running in the halls, he came and he gave a guest presentation to our AP biology class. Yes, I was in advanced placement. And out of the 25 kids, I was the only one who showed interest. And then the next day he gifted me a sundew and a Venus flytrap, which I killed in about 3 weeks. I then went to college and I found other people who liked carnivorous plants and plants in general. And I said, oh, I know just the person who we should reconnect with. So we went over to his house. He taught us how to hybridize daylilies. And of course, he taught us how to grow carnivorous plants. So then I co-founded the Western New York Carnivorous Plant Society. I'm from Buffalo, New York, Niagara Falls, New York. And today I'm going to give you a 45-minute presentation on the 34 types of carnivorous plants that you can find in the state of Florida. But if you're interested, I do have a 1-hour presentation on each of them. I moved to Florida about 11 or 12 years ago. I was teaching and I had this as a side hobby. And then during COVID, I decided I was going to retire. So now I do the carnivorous plant business full time. I've written 6 TED-Ed videos. One of them is about carnivorous plants. I think it has maybe 4 or 5 million views. My biggest one is Why Are Sloths So Slow? That one I think has 6 or 7 million. I just published one about the worm wrangling that happens in the panhandle. And then my next one is going to come out in maybe 2 or 3 months. And it's going to be about Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and the Everglades. And if we, yeah, this group knows what I'm talking about. But if you don't, you will learn about her and the Everglades in a few months. In addition to those 6 animated videos, I've also written 5 animated videos for the International Carnivorous Plant Society, and you're going to be seeing little videos of those and the TED-Ed videos today in this presentation. So today we're going to be talking about carnivores. We're going to be talking about organisms that have sharp teeth, really strong grasping power, but we are not talking about animals. We are talking about plants, and all carnivorous plants have those same adaptations, just like those animals do. And sadly, there are no carnivorous plants that are large enough to eat a human. I know, it is sad. The largest one can eat 2 or 3 mice a year. So they can eat mammals. And what I find interesting is that Florida, we have 34 different types of carnivorous plants. And around the world, there's around 900 to 1,000 species of plants that are carnivorous, and 0 of them use their flowers to trap and kill their prey. So when you're at Lou Gardens and you see me at a plant sale and we have those beautiful hanging pitchers, those pitcher plants, which are not native to Florida, people say, how do I get them to bloom? Well, I can tell you that, but their flowers are so tiny, I don't think that's what you're actually asking for. You're actually asking, how do you get those modified leaves to come out? So in the state of Florida, all the way to the left, we have a North American pitcher plant, and they flower January through March. But if you look closely, you'll see that their pitchers are not open. They just kind of have these sword-like leaves, and that is so they avoid eating their pollinators. So the pollinators, which are bees and bumblebees and wasps, will pollinate them, and they have their traps closed. And then after they're pollinated, they open up, and they do eat the pollinators that serviced them a few weeks early. So they're pretty deceptive. The One in the middle is a butterwort that's found in Florida, and then all the way to the right, we have Venus flytraps, which are also found in Florida. And they have these really tall flower stalks, so they can avoid eating their pollinators. Their pollinators are small flying insects, and what they eat are crawling organisms. So they're going to be eating beetles and spiders, but they're being pollinated by flying organisms. And in the state of Florida, the types of animals that they're going to be eating are very tiny, microscopic protozoa, spiders, midges, wasps, ants, things like that. And somebody always asks me, which one eats mosquitoes? And none of them eat mosquitoes. Don't leave. Mosquitoes want blood, and all of these plants are using color and nectar to attract their prey. So mosquitoes, unless they accidentally get confused, will not be being eaten by carnivorous plants in general. In the book, like I mentioned so many times, I talked about 34 species. One of them is a non-native, and one of them is extirpated, which means it's extinct in the state of Florida, but you can find it in some South American countries. And to figure out why we have so many carnivorous plants, you have to go back to the last Pleistocene era, which is the last ice age, about 2.5 million years ago. And during that time, there was a lot of ice in the North and the South poles, and there was so much ice there that the sea level was 300 feet lower than it is today. And that made Florida 3 times wider than it is today. And plants unconsciously had 2 choices. One was that they could hope for a random mutation that allowed them to overwinter, or the second option was for them to migrate. And I don't know if you've ever seen a plant migrate. They do it very slowly. So the way that they migrate is they would release seeds. The seeds that went a little more south, they were able to live and reproduce. The ones that stayed north froze and died. So over about 1.5 million years, you get about 40 different species of carnivorous plants migrating from the north down to the southeast. And they were able to stay there for a couple of reasons. One was because of the Gulf. The Gulf moderated our temperatures, and we had 4 seasons, and you can see there's like a little band there. And another reason why they were able to stay and do really well is because of the sun. But I just wanted to give you a reference. Back then, we had giant ground sloths roaming Tennessee. We had 7-foot tall camels roaming the west, and we had a big cat called the Smiler. So it was a very long time. So like I was mentioning earlier, Florida has a lot of sun and carnivorous plants like that. And they also benefit from the naturally occurring wildfires that we were experiencing. And that is because all carnivorous plants photosynthesize, but they don't do it as well as non-carnivorous plants. So if you want to soak up a lot of sun, you want to be flat, and you want to be able to get as many rays as possible. But when you think about carnivorous plants, many of their leaves are tubes, or they're on a hinge, or they're underground, and they can't photosynthesize. So they need extra sunlight. And when a fire happens, it gets rid of the taller shrubs and trees, and then that allows them to get that extra sunlight that they need. Then about 10,000 years ago, the ice caps melted. And what scares scientists is that out of the 40 or so that made it down to the southeast, only a handful of them have been able to recolonize the east and the north. So we have a sundew that's up and down the east coast all the way up to New Jersey. And we have a pitcher plant that's up and down the east coast, up into Canada and over to Michigan. But that's only like 5 out of 40 species. So scientists are thinking about, well, what happens if the environment changes faster than it has in the last 10,000 years? Will they be able to adapt? Now, if you're looking for carnivorous plants, a great way to find them is you're going to look for soil that's kind of saturated, moist to damp, and then you can historically look underneath power lines and telephone lines, because those companies or those governments mow that area, and then mowing mimics naturally occurring fires to get rid of the taller shrubs or trees. And this photo is taken in Volusia County, and all the photos that you see are in my book. Now, I've just sold about 1,600 copies of my book. And once we get, thank you. And once we get to 2,000 copies, we're going to print more. And we're not having a second edition yet, But this next round that we're going to be printing, I have about 15 edits that I've put in. And one of them is this photo. So this photo says what I just told you. If you're looking for carnivorous plants around Florida, look underneath power lines, cell phone lines. The mowing mimics naturally wild occurring flowers. However, we have to add a sentence now. This population no longer exists because in the past year, this county has decided to use herbicides instead of mowing. Yes, you should boo. All right. And the last reason why we have so many carnivorous plants is because we have wet soils. This map was drawn about 300 years ago from the Franciscan monks. They came over, they were talking to the indigenous people, and they said, you know, what's going on with this peninsula? And the Native Americans said from Tampa south, you know, it wasn't called Tampa, but Central Peninsula south, you could canoe coast to coast. That's how saturated Florida was. And that's probably true because the Everglades were 8 to 10 feet. The river was 8 to 10 feet higher than it is today. So Florida was very saturated. Then they did a lot of surveys. They said, wow, there's this giant lizard thing at this part of the world that we've never seen before. There's orchids that we've never seen before. There's flowers, you know. Wow, this is really special. And what did they think of that? They said, well, let's drain the swamp, let's change everything, and let's grow cotton and sugar. In 1904, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, he ran and won the governorship with the motto, water will run downhill. He promised everyone that he was going to drain Florida and everyone could be a farmer. At the same time, Frank Stoneman, he was the editor of the Miami Herald, and he said that, yes, Florida is a wasteland and it's very soggy and there's lots of mosquitoes and giant lizard things, but it's going to be too much time, too much energy, too much effort to drain it. So he was definitely opposed to that, but he said that Florida was a wasteland. At the same time, early 1900s, we have Mayman Jennings. She looked at the surveys and she said, you know, people really like flowers. People like wild animals. And if we can start establishing some parks and wild places, we could have up to 1,000 tourists visit Florida a year. And today we have 1,000 people moving to Florida a day. She's nicknamed the mother of Florida forestry because she was able to establish some of the first parks. Now, we have to mention she's probably wearing an endangered or an extinct bird feather in her hat. All right, a little bit later, maybe 1910, Minnie Moore Wilson, she's also a European. She is seeing the way that we treat the Native Americans. We're pushing them into the Everglades because we saw the Everglades are a wasteland, or we're shipping them to Oklahoma. She was talking to the Miccosukee tribes and the Seminole tribes, and she noticed that the better they did, the better the environment did. And the better the environment was, the better off they were. So she kind of assimilated into their culture, and she was a really good supporter of the Native American people and protecting their lands. Then many years later, in 1947, we get this woman signing a book, and she's quoted as saying, "It is a woman's business to be interested in the environment. It's an extended form of housekeeping." And her name is Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. She's the daughter of Frank Stoneman, who said that Florida was a wasteland, and she disagreed. She went to the Everglades. She lived there for about 5 to 7 years. And then in 1947, she wrote a book, The Everglades River of Grass. And a few months later, the National Park Everglades was established in the same year. In 1969, when she was 79 years old, she had to form the Friends of the Everglades because people were still trying to farm cotton and sugar in the Everglades, and they built a runway for an international airport inside the Everglades. She died when she was 108 fighting for the Everglades. Well, if you have purpose, you can live long. So why haven't we talked about carnivorous plants yet? Well, that's because those women were able to save land for our carnivorous plants. 1 out of the 3 of our state's carnivorous plants are in the Everglades. The other 3rd are in the Panhandle. And then the other 3rd are cosmopolitan. They're all over the state of Florida. And I also wanted to remind you that diversity in species and who is in power is a benefit, because those men had like a myopic lens. They only knew about farming. So they're like, well, that's the only thing we can do. But these women were thinking, yo, we could have people just visit this land and protect it at the same time. All right. So for the rest of the presentation, we are going to be talking about the carnivorous plants. In the book, I talk about why it's so important to use scientific names. Like I mentioned earlier, there's 800 to 1,000 species of plants that eat flies. So if you say the word fly trap, it might be a little confusing. In 13 days from now, I will be going to Japan for the International Carnivorous Plant Society's conference. And if you say fly trap, no matter, there's going to be 113 attendees, 47 of them are not from Japan. If you say fly trap, they do know what you're talking about. But if you say, bug eater, that's going to get a little confusing. So the scientific name for the fly trap is Dionaea muscipula. Muscipula means mouse trap. So you can imagine people finding them about 300 years ago, say, wow, this hinges like a mouse trap. We'll call it that. And then they called it Dionaea because back then, really the only famous biologists or botanists were men. And these guys, you can imagine them, they're in the woods in the Carolinas by themselves. Maybe they're aroused, maybe they're horny, maybe they miss their wife. So they named it Dionaea after one of 4 Greek goddesses. So those Greek goddesses are the goddesses of love and beauty and sex and romance. And they named it that because they said when they looked at it, it reminded them of a female anatomy. But I don't see it, so we'll keep moving on. So why are we talking about Venus flytraps in a Florida carnivorous plant presentation? And that is because in 1971, somebody started planting them in the Panhandle. They've been here for 51 years. We have 2 locations. Both of them are about the size of this room. And those populations die back every year. They get frozen every year. They get eaten by bugs. We do not call them invasive because they haven't gone anywhere. So they're still in like those 2 original bogs, but they are non-native. And if I don't mention them in a carnivorous plant presentation, I get sued because people love them. So the way that they work is on each lobe, they have 2 to 4 trigger hairs. And if you or a bug touches one of those trigger hairs, a little calcium action potential wave goes up. But outside, nothing happens. If you or a bug touches that same trigger hair or another one, within 20 seconds, a second calcium action potential wave goes up. And then that causes water to move from the inside of the trap to the outside. And because there's more water on the outside of the trap, it's heavier, and then it snaps shut. Back in the 60s and 70s, people would try to feed them hamburgers and hot dogs and things like that. And they died. But those people died. No, the Venus flytraps died. And what happened was we found out just recently, maybe in the past 2 or 3 years, that those hairs need to be hit a few more times for the sealing phase to work. So once the trap closes, the more those trigger hairs get touched, that triggers the digestive enzymes to start being pumped into that external stomach. It takes 4 to 10 days for the Venus flytrap to eat. And then after that time, they open up and all that's left is the exoskeleton. And here we have 2 healthy Venus flytraps. Both of them have some yellow and black leaves. And that's because Venus flytrap leaf can only work 3 times. It can only digest 3 times, and then it turns black and it dies. If you stick your finger in there like 8 times, that's fine. It just gets a little tired. But if it's digesting something, it can only open and close 3 times. And then it turns black. Then you can take scissors, you can cut it off. And as long as you have new growth coming from the center, it's a perfectly healthy plant. And this is true for pretty much all carnivorous plants. They have a much higher leaf turnover rate than non-carnivorous plants, because in addition to photosynthesizing, they're also digesting. So they have, a couple of jobs. So that's normal. And the picture on the left, that's one plant with 10 leaves. So that means it can eat 30 times. The picture on the right, that's one plant with maybe 20 leaves. So that means it can eat 60 times. But the idea is that it's producing new leaves. All right, the next ones are the Sarracenia. In the book, I have distribution maps for most of the types of carnivorous plants found in the state of Florida. Sarracenia are the beautiful pitcher plants. They're named after a scientist, a doctor actually, Michael Sarracenia from like the mid 1700s. And he discovered the first pitcher plant in Canada. He sent it to Carl Linnaeus. Do we know who Carl Linnaeus is? Remember him? He's in charge of taxonomy. He's the reason why we have 2 scientific names for each fungi, plant, and animal. And Michael Sarracenia, he sent it to Carl Linnaeus and he said, I discovered a plant that eats bugs. And Carl Linnaeus said, you fool, it is ungodly to think that a plant could eat an animal. But that was a good attempt, so we will name the genus after you, but I am not accepting the idea that plants can eat animals. This is like 1750. And then in 1887, the scientific community said, yes, plants can eat animals. So it's quite a bit. The way that they work is they have some nectar underneath their lid. Sometimes they have nectar on top of their lid. And in that nectar, they have a chemical called choline in it. And that chemical can also be found in poison hemlock and poison ivy. And when bugs drink it, they get a little intoxicated. They get a little drunk, and then they fall down that pitcher. And inside the pitcher is digestive enzymes that has a wetting agent that prevents their wings and their legs from working. And then they drown, and then it takes them 2 weeks to 2 months to digest their food. If a larger organism like a salamander or a frog or a spider goes in there, what they usually do is they steal the plant's food and then they just crawl back out. All right, so these are the species that you can find in the state of Florida. We do not have Sarracenia alabamenensis, that is in Alabama, but we do have a subspecies called warei. And we do not have Sarracenia rubra, that's on the Atlantic coast. We do have a subspecies called gulfensis. So the difference is warei is smaller than the ones found in Alabama, and our subspecies gulfensis are larger than the ones that are found on the Atlantic. Both of these plants get about 18 inches, and I do have several of them for sale. I forgot to mention, if you like any of these plants, I do have them for sale. So you're going to be learning 34 plants. It might be hard to remember which ones you like, but here's some of those examples. So the next one is Sarracenia flava. Flava means yellow, so they have a yellow flower. And the ones that I brought are solid green. What's cool about them is in addition to having nectar underneath their lid, they also have nectar on top of their lid. Do you see that semicircle up there? So if you're a wasp, you're thinking, wow, this is a pretty good deal. I get a giant landing helicopter pad and I get a free snack, but then you get drunk and you die. All right, so here we have 2 different types. On the left, we have ornata, and on the right, we have rubricorpora. So these are varieties of flava. So that means these can be found in the same areas and they can interbreed with each other. I do have 4 pots of these with these beautiful black veins available. And then this is another one called Rugelia. And in the common name is called a cutthroat pitcher plant because it's all green and has like a little red spot on its throat. The next species that we have are also about 3 feet tall when they're full grown. It takes them 4 to 5 years to reach maturity. All of the plants I brought, all the Sarracenia that I brought are about 3 to 5 years old. Leucophylla means white top. So the top third of them are white. They have these beautiful like kind of lattice work. And what's cool about them is that they have these little hairs underneath their lid. And scientists say that when they're running around that lid, drinking up the nectar, if they decide to back up, they get poked by the hairs. And then they're encouraged to go farther down into that pitcher. And then the top third is very slippery, and then they slide down into the digestive enzymes. Sarracenia minor is the only native pitcher plant that you can find over here in Orlando. All the other ones are more on the panhandle. Sarracenia minor was first discovered by Europeans in 1539, and then people didn't know they ate bugs until 1887. So 250 years later. The next one is the parrot pitcher. So that's where you get its name. Instead of standing upright, it lays horizontal, and they can also be found kind of floating down rivers. And then the last one that we have native is Sarracenia rosea. These are little chubby guys, and they have pink flowers. And this is endemic to Florida. You can only find it in Florida. And then the one that's up and down the East Coast, up into Canada, is called Sarracenia purpurea. And that's the best known pitcher plant. It's the most studied. And because they don't have a lid that prevents rainwater from going in, they don't use their own, they don't have their own digestive enzymes. They use symbiotic bacteria. So just like we have a lot of bacteria in our gut that helps break down our meals, so do they. And because of that, over 30 species live and breed inside that pitcher. Salamanders, protozoa, algae, rotifer, spiders, midges, lots of things are breeding in this type of pitcher plant. Now, I hope you are thinking, wow, those are some really sexy Sarracenia. And I agree, but that's not really what I'm talking about. Here we have 3 pictures of 3 naturally occurring hybrids. So Sarracenia are promiscuous. They will have sex with anything that's near them. And here is a list of all of the naturally occurring hybrids that you can find in the state of Florida or neighboring states. And right here, this Chelsonii, I brought one of those. Now, why are they so promiscuous? Why are they having sex with anything that's near them? You have to look at their sexual organs, which of course are their flowers. And if you dissect it vertically like this, you can see the inside of the pitcher plant's flowers. And the way that they're pollinated, it's pretty strict. The bugs only have 4 choices to get in there. And that is to fly up and under a sepal, and then they're going to fly over that structure, and then they're going to walk around this upside down umbrella, and they're going to accidentally pick up the pollen that has fallen off the anthers, but that has been so conveniently caught by this upside down umbrella shape. And then when they leave, they only have 4 choices again. And those 4 choices are the 4 holes that are caused by the drooping petals. So they're going to parachute out of it. And then when they go visit the next flower, which is 1 foot away or 100 feet away, they're going to repeat this process. And when they repeat this process, they're going to go underneath the sepal, over the stigma. And when they go over the stigma, they're going to be scraping off the pollen from the last flower onto the stigma, which is where fertilization occurs. And that is how you get all these hybrids. Now, in the month of March, I published 15 hours of roundtables about carnivorous plants. So I have 1 hour about breeding Venus flytraps. I have 1 hour about growing Venus flytraps. I have 1 hour about breeding Sarracenia. And when I did this, I interviewed people all over the world. So for the Sarracenia group, I interviewed Matt Soper. He's in London, and he wins the Chelsea Royal Botanical Show every year with Sarracenia. And then I interviewed a couple of really famous growers in Washington and Oregon. And then I interviewed a grower in Ocala, Florida. And the Matt in London, he goes, I take a metal scapula and I pick up the pollen between the hours of 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. And then I tap the metal scapula so the pollen forms a perfect line. And then I touch each of the 4 stigmas. I do this three times a day, 3 days in a row. And then I put a bag over the flower to make sure I know, who's the parent. And then the Washington and the Oregon people agreed. Yes, we do that too. And then the Ocala guy goes, oh, I just spit on my finger and pick up the pollen and just rub the stigmas. Yes, he yeah. He did Florida well that day. All right, on the left, I have, remember Sarracenia leucophylla, it's the white top. Well, this is a variety called ginger. It's found in Milton, Florida, so it's in the county of Milton. And instead of being a white top, it's this beautiful red. And I brought 3 of those with me today. And the reason why I'm showing you these pictures is because at the back of each of the chapters, I have a commonly cared for carnivorous section. So it says, oh yeah, even though they're native, this one's really hard to find. These are easy to grow. This is what you want. So I just wanted to show you that. The next type of carnivorous plant that you can find in the Florida is Utricularia. That scientific name means wine flask, leather bottle, or bagpipe. So you're probably thinking, wow, these are going to be pretty cool. And you're right, they look like pond scum. If you look at them up close, they have these beautiful bladders. You don't need a microscope. You can just look at them under your normal glasses or with a really good camera. And the way that they work, now remember, all carnivorous plants use modified leaves. So this is not a root, this is not a stolon, this is actually a modified leaf that's underwater or underground. And they have these little trigger hairs. And the way that they work is if a tiny little organism bumps into it, they will have their little trap door open inwards. And when that happens, it's like a vacuuming effect. So they kind of suck in soil, water, the little organism, and then they, in about 20 minutes, they pump out the extra soil, the extra water, and then they start digesting their prey. And if you're a bigger organism like a mosquito or a tadpole, you want to be caught head first, because if you're bigger than the bladder, the Utricularia will just digest whatever is inside the bladder when the rest of you struggles on the outside. So you want to go head first. And this is the claymation that was from my TED Ed video. And after we made it, I asked the artist if I could have all of these clay figures. And he said I couldn't have the tadpole because he had to destroy it in the making of this TED Ed. But I did get the Sarracenia and the bladderwort and blah, blah, and they're all about 3 inches made out of clay. So yeah, as a lifelong vegetarian, I think this is really funny. They eat mosquito larvae and all right. Here we have a beautiful Utricularia geba with that beautiful yellow flower. And does anyone see a second species of Utricularia in this photo? Yes, I see heads nodding. And those tiny little white flowers are another species. In the state of Florida, we have 11 species of, no, we don't. We have 14 species of bladderworts. 11 of them are yellow. We only have 1 that is white. So if you find the white one, then you know it's Utricularia olivaceae. But the problem is they only flower for 4 weeks a year. So when they're not flowering, you're going to need to look for that tiny little strand of green floating in a water body. Here we have 2 other species of bladderworts. These are 2 different species. So here we have the ruler. On the right, we have 1 species, and on the left, we have a different species. And the way you know that they're 2 different species is that one of them has a different number of floating arms than the other one. But I counted, and all of them have the exact same number of arms. And the other way you can tell the difference, well, let me back up. One of them has 4 to 6 floating arms, and the other one has 5 to 10 floating arms. So sometimes they do have the same number of floating arms, but the better way to identify them is the little one on the right is Utricularia radiata. Their floating arms are a perfect cylindrical shape. And then Utricularia inflata, which is the bigger one, their floating arms taper at the tip. So that's one way you can identify. So like I mentioned, we have 11 yellow ones. And in the book, I have a 2-page spread table of like how you can separate them. One easy way is half of them are aquatic, half of them are terrestrial. And then the aquatic ones, some of them are freely floating, and then others anchor to the bottom of a body of water. Historically, we've had 3 species that were purple or pink. This one in the middle is the extirpated one. No one has seen it for about 15 or 20 years. And that is because the last known site is now part of the I-4. So they decided to build that on the last known site of this Utricularia. We do have 2 other purple pink species that you can find. And when they bloom, it's amazing. They bloom in mass, so you get thousands and thousands of flowers. The next group are, let me back it up, I forgot. All right, the top left picture is Utricularia subulata. And behind them, you have those beautiful red leaves. That's a cypress sundew, which we're going to talk in a minute. But I have to mention that Utricularia are the herpes of the carnivorous plant world. Once you have them, you will never get rid of them. And you're not going to be paying for them today. You will be getting them as a free gift. They only will grow in carnivorous plant soil, which we'll talk about at the end, but they're not going to be like popping up in your yard or in your other pots or anything like that. All right, so the next group are the pinguiculas. That means greasy ones or buttery ones. So their common name are butterwort. You can see their distribution of the 6 species that we have here are a little more widespread. They look like a pile of tongues, so they're pretty cool. And the way that they work is that their leaves are sticky. They eat tiny things like fruit flies and fungus gnats. All right, now we're going to take a pretend field trip. These 2 plants you're going to find in higher elevation, as in higher elevation for Florida. You're going to be walking in like a pine woods area, and it's going to be pretty dry. So that's where you're going to find these 2. We have Pinguicula cerulea. Cerulea means like sky blue or ocean blue. So they have blue flowers. I brought 2 of these with me today. And then we also have Pinguicula ionantha. They have like a pink, they have a white and a pink flower. So they both like a little bit drier than all the other ones. All right, now we're going in lower elevation. These plants like it a little more wet. We have lutea and pumila. Pumila is it, all of them are perennials, but pumila is like a short-lived perennial. It only lives like 2 years and then it flowers and dies. So people are not going to be selling that, or people don't really buy it. Just because it's native doesn't mean it's a good backyard plant. The next one is Pinguicula planifolia. As you can see, they can live in really submerged areas. They can be underwater for many months of the year. And when they're underwater, they can still trap and digest organisms. And then the last one is Pinguicula primuliflora. This is it's endangered in the state of Florida, but they make 250,000 of them in tissue culture a year. So they're the easiest ones to find for cultivation. And they're very easy to grow. Each of them get about 5 to 6 inches across. And then at the tip of each of their arms, they'll have 3 to 5 babies. And you can just pluck off those little pups and you can spread them around your bog or your water feature. This is my favorite photo in the entire book. It shows a clear water stream with a little mud island with lots of really large Pinguicula primuliflora. And I don't know if you guys know this, but tomorrow is the 3rd annual World Carnivorous Plant Day. And I'm in charge of that event. So tonight at 11 p.m., the International Carnivorous Plant Society will be publishing its first video for World Carnivorous Plant Day. And then on the hour, every hour for the next 26 or 27 hours, I publish a video through the International Carnivorous Plant Society. Some of the videos are in Italian, some of them are in Portuguese, some of them are in Spanish, most of them are in English, but they are from scientists from all over the world. And then I think at 1 o'clock on May 4th, 1 a.m., if you're up, you can go to that channel and you can watch the annual photo contest. So everyone can enter. You don't need to be a member. Everyone's allowed to submit up to 5 photos. And the person who won last year won with this photo, except their photo was taken in the state of Texas, but it was the same species, same composition, same clear water stream, same mud island. So you have a chance to win the next photo contest. If you win, you get a 1-year membership to the International Carnivorous Plant Society. All right, the next group are the sundews, Drosera or Drosera. We have 5 different species. And these ones are cosmopolitan. They're very tiny. Both of them are about the size of a quarter. Brevifolia has wedge-shaped leaves, and then Capillaris has more spoon leaf shaped leaves. Both of them are the size of the quarter. Both of them only live about 2 years, and then they flower themselves to death. All right, the next one is Drosera intermedia. They live in intermediate conditions. They're a little bit taller. Then we have Drosera filiformis. That's found up and down the East Coast, but we have a variety that's only found in Florida that's a little more red and a little bit more orange than the other species. And then our largest one is Drosera tracei, filiformis variety floridiana. It's about 12 to 14 inches tall. And then tracei can get up to 20 inches tall, and it's all green, whereas filiformis is red. Now, I brought a couple of tracei with me. And I also brought a sundew called Drosera californica. And that is because many years ago, somebody took our variety of Filiformis and they bred it to Tracei. And Filiformis variety Floridiana can only be found in Florida. And they took it and they bred it to Tracei. And because they lived in California, they called it Drosera californica. And then years later, we learned that it's a naturally occurring hybrid that you can only find in the state of Florida. So now we have a plant called californica, but it only is found in Florida. And the last carnivorous plant species that we have is a carnivorous bromeliad. There's about 2,500 species of bromeliads around the world. And as of today, only 3 of them are considered carnivorous. And I do know that we have a couple of species of Catopsis, but this is the only one that's carnivorous. And what makes this and the other 2 that are in South America carnivorous is that unlike other bromeliads, they grow in full sun. So where you would find them is on a canopy, but they're going to be on a branch like outside of the canopy receiving full sun. And they have this white powder on their leaves. And unlike other bromeliads, their white powder causes insects not to see UV light. So it causes insects to collide in the side of the leaf, and then they roll down. And then some symbiotic bacteria breaks down those bugs, and the plants that are eating them benefit. And that's one of the definitions of what is and what isn't a carnivorous plant. Around the world, there are 268,000 species of flowering plants. Now, remember, we have ferns and we have conifers and things like that. So there's 268,000 angiosperms. About 1,000 of them are carnivorous. And the International Union of Conservation of Nature is a group of 10,600 volunteers that have PhDs, have doctorates, who study plants, animals, and fungi. And they determine if an organism in their specialty is endangered, threatened, least concern, common. The IUCN has looked at 3% of all of the angiosperms of the world. And of the 3% that they have looked at, 70% of them are vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. So we are not doing very good. Only 30% are doing okay. And why do we care about that? Well, carnivorous plants are disproportionately more endangered and more threatened than non-carnivorous plants. Sundews, their biggest problem is agriculture activity. Pesticides, herbicides, getting rid of the land for cows and corn. Sarracenia, the pitcher plants, this is an order. Their biggest problem is natural system modification, us draining the swamp, us building cul-de-sacs and malls where they used to live, and then we have an abandoned mall now. The next one is invasive species. We have wild hogs digging them up. We have climbing ferns and air potato blocking the sun that they need. The next one is pollution. The next one is over collection, which is poaching. The reason why it's way down there is because there isn't enough to poach anymore. And then the last one is agriculture. So I work with a lot of master gardeners, and I was talking to David Jennings from University of South Florida, and he said insecticide use above, within, or below the recommended treatment level can be harmful to carnivorous plants. And that makes sense because if your neighbor is spraying their house to kill the spiders, and it also kills all the other insects, and they venture into your backyard and your plant eats the poison bug, or that bug goes into a wild bog area and feeds the wild plants, they're not going to do that. And let me back up. We also want to stress that the backyard gardener is actually more likely to misuse fertilizer and pesticides and herbicides than the big commercial farms, because there are people who can just kind of randomly visit those farms and see what's going on, whereas the backyard gardener, nobody's really watching. So we can all do our part. And then the last thing is Utricularia, the bladderworts. Their biggest problem is pollution, specifically the eutrophication of water systems. And that is when you apply fertilizer to your non-native grass yard, and that fertilizer goes into the rivers, and it gives them so many nutrients that we get all these algae growing, and the algae blocks the light for the bladderworts, and then that goes into the ocean, and that is how we get more red tide. All right, back in the 50s, Aldo Leopold, he's a famous conservationist. He said there are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot. So I think he was saying, some people love nature, they have to be out in nature, and then there's others who can, skip it. But today we know that we actually all need nature, we all need wild places and wild things for a healthy ecosystem. The places where carnivorous plants grow, they clean our air, they purify our water, they maintain our soil, they regulate the climate, they recycle nutrients, and they provide food and medicine for animals and plants and maybe even people. So if we protect their habitat, we can help ourselves, but maybe less selfishly, the ecosystem. So hopefully you're feeling a little bit inspired and you're thinking, how can I help? Well, the biggest thing you could do is educate others about the value of wild habitats. I host a weekly radio show in Tampa. It's on WMNF Tampa, and you can listen to the archive shows. It's every Monday from 11 to noon. It's called Sustainable Living. And every Monday we ask experts on the radio show. So about 6 months ago, we had professors from Eckerd College, and they were talking about microplastics. So you can buy soaps and hand sanitizers that have these little balls in them that, that exfoliate your skin, but they're literally made out of plastic. And then when you're done rubbing it on your face, it goes down into the sink, and then it goes into the waterways, and then the fish eat it, or even shrimp eat it, then the fish eat the shrimp. Then you eat the fish that has plastic in it. I just saw today that they said that there's plastic in our blood, it's in our placenta, it's like everywhere. And then today or yesterday, they said that now they've seen bits of plastic in our brain. So at the end of it, we said, how can, what's the takeaway message? How can listeners help? And my co-host said, stop using plastic bottles, right? So I said, well, let's ask the expert. And then the expert said the best thing you could do is actually to tell 10 other people to stop using plastic bottles. Because if you stop, that's pretty good. But if you tell 10 other people and they stop, and then they tell 10 other people, that's how you get a movement going. So we need to educate people that Florida has the most carnivorous plants. We need to educate people that Florida has a lot of native plants, endemic plants, because if people don't know that we have these things, they're not going to want to save them. Another thing you could do is join and support the North American Sarracenia Conservancy. Every month for the International Carnivorous Plant Society, I host a monthly webinar. Many months ago, we had a scientist from Texas, and she said, I'm kind of getting tired of going to people's backyards and houses and saying, hey, can I go in your backyard and count how many bugs your Sarracenia have eaten? And can I, measure them, see how much they've grown since last year? And she has to have like these little town meetings and saying, you guys are going to have a controlled fire, on blocks A through C, and you guys aren't going to have a controlled fire. So we said, well, why do you need to keep doing that? Why do you have to keep talking to these homeowners? And she said, because 95% of all Sarracenia in the state of Texas are grown on private property. So you can't just make a wall because it's on their property. They can do whatever they want. They can mow them over, they could dig them up. So we need to engage. You could also join the International Carnivorous Plant Society. For this year, 2023, our conservation mission is Sarracenia. We have 7 out of the 11 in our state. So this year it's Sarracenia. Next year, we could be in Australia. We could be in South America, but this year it's the North American pitcher plant. So what we do is we send our conservation director to the Panhandle and neighboring states. And he, along with a lot of government officials, assess that land. And then we work with the Nature Conservancy. And then we basically buy land so people can't develop. So that's what we're doing this year. Last year, next year is going to be different. And the last thing that you can do is plant native plants in your yard, which you probably all know. So the last section is going to be how to grow Florida's carnivorous plants. And it's the shortest section because it's very easy. The biggest thing is they need pure water. They need distilled water, rainwater, or reverse osmosis water. Well water and city water usually kills them very, very quickly in about 5 weeks. So a lot of people try the well water and usually it's not good enough. So it really needs to be pure water. before the talk, I was mentioning that I have about 5,000 carnivorous plants, and I have 8 50-gallon rain barrels. And that gets me through the year, because now through September, it rains 1 to 14 times a week. And then I don't have to water them, I just have them outside. And then in the winter months, that's when I use the reserve. The second thing about Florida's carnivorous plants is that they need to be sitting in water all the time. So if you have a tray like on the right, that's called the 10-20 tray, you can put all your pots in there. You could get a upside down Frisbee, you can get a plate, you can get Tupperware. They just need to be sitting in about 1/8 to 1/4 inch of pure water all the time. If you have a pond with or without fish, you can float them in the pond, you can put them on the ledge of a pond. If you have a bird bath, you can put them on there. So that's what the bottom left photo is. The top left is a claw-footed tub that's filled with water around the lava rock, and the carnivorous plants are planted inside the lava rock, which are just peeking out of the water. And then the other 2 pictures on the right, I'm showing you that you can grow the sundews next to the pitcher plants, next to the flytraps, next to the butterworts. So they all need the same care. In the bog area, you can use a kiddie pool, you can use a cement mixer tub, you know, you can use a plastic liner. You're going to fill it with half peat and half perlite, or half sphagnum moss and half perlite. In the pandemic, we were reminded that peat is not a sustainable product. It takes about 10,000 years for sphagnum to break down into peat. And up until the pandemic, you could buy this very large case for about $10. So 10,000 years to us is $10. So about 7 or 8 presentations ago, I used to say that the European Union was banning the sale of peat for residential gardening use by like 2025. But I've had to stop saying that because so many backyard gardeners threw a little hissy fit that the lawmakers have kind of put it off to the side. And we're allowing people to still dig up bogs that are 10,000 years old. And what lives in the bogs? Carnivorous plants and native plants and native orchids. So we don't really want to be using peat anymore. What's cool about sphagnum is, I don't know if I brought any live. I mean, I see little strands. I don't know if it will bounce back. This section probably will. I got a little section, maybe this big, of live sphagnum. I put it in a kiddie pool, and within about 2 to 3 months, the entire kiddie pool was filled with live sphagnum. And if you have live sphagnum, you can plant the carnivorous plants solely in that, and the bottom layers will die, and that's normal. That's how it turns into peat. So you can just use live sphagnum, or you can buy the dried sphagnum. Alternatives include coconut core and coconut husk. This is a byproduct of us eating and drinking coconuts. So you can use those things. You would have to rinse them a few times because most of the coconuts are grown on the coast of African countries and Asian countries, and they have some salt spray. So you just have to soak them and then drain them. And I usually soak them and drain them about 3 times, and then they're good for the carnivorous plants. You could also use a new product called pit moss. If you've ever seen a cardboard box, you'll know that there's like tiny little rectangles missing in the corner so you can fold your box up. Well, a college student, like a 20-year-old student a year or 2 ago, said, hey, let's do something with all those little rectangles. So he took it, he kind of more shredded them up. So pit moss kind of looks like guinea pig or hamster bedding, and you can use that as a peat alternative. You would have to still mix it with half perlite, which is volcanic. All right, so that's the soil. For the amount of sun, you're going to give them full Florida sun. That means a vegetable garden amount. That means 6 to 8 hours of full Florida sun. If you have more, the better. They'll be more colorful, they'll grow bigger, and they really need a lot of sun. So you're gonna have to balance them sitting in water with full sun. And with that, I thank you very much.